Now, today, we're going to look into the US president's controversial expulsion campaign. Donald Trump promised to carry out the biggest mass deportation plan in US history. Well, many of those deportees are now being dumped in Africa. And you know what? Many of them are not even from the African countries they're being sent to. They're not even from Africa. I'm Stefanie Dekker, and welcome to The Stream. Now, these deportations are part of a wider political context. Here's The Stream's Nadine Yasser to give you some background.
Why is Africa treated as the West's human dumping ground? There's been a series of controversial deals Donald Trump has struck with some African nations to take in deportees that he wants out of America. Now, some of these nations include Eswatini, South Sudan, Rwanda, and Uganda. And the reason these deals are causing heavy backlash is that many of the deportees are convicted criminals from different nationalities and have no real connection to the countries they're being deported to. So if these aren't their homelands, why is Africa bearing the burden? This is part of a troubling global pattern where rich countries outsource their migration problems to poorer ones, usually without regard to the human rights and welfare of those people, or even the impact on the host countries. We've seen Western powers do this time and time again, even as far back as 19th century African colonies. These places were often used as dumping destinations for refugees, political prisoners, and essentially anyone that European powers deemed as undesirable. But the question remains, how long will Africa continue to bear the cost, and at what human price?
Now, to help us unpack all of that, we're joined by Daniel Akech. He's a senior analyst for South Sudan at the International Crisis Group. His research aims to provide insights into conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution in the region. He joins us from Nairobi in Kenya. And we have Melusi Simelane. He's a human rights advocate from Eswatini who promotes equality, social justice, and accountability. He's also a civic rights lead at the Southern Africa Litigation Center, and he is in Brighton, in the UK. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. Melusi, can I start with you? What do we know about these deals? I will ask you specifically about Eswatini because you are from there. Has the government been transparent?
The government has not been transparent, Stephanie, and thank you for having us. And just to sort of play it down for you, this happened on the 16th or the 17th of July, and the only reason that Eswatini citizens, including civil society, were aware of this deal was because of the US Homeland Security people who tweeted on their Facebook pages and their Twitter pages that a plane had landed in Eswatini. And as soon as this happened, civil society went up in arms because of the way that the United States had described these people as dangerous criminals, as people who had been convicted of heinous crimes. Now, mind you, we were not aware of the fact that these were people who had served their time in America already, just being trafficked to Eswatini. So the country has not been transparent in terms of addressing this issue, letting us know why these people are in the country and what is the deal exactly.
And what they got in return, right? Daniel, Eswatini has taken deportees. South Sudan has taken deportees. South Sudan has a plethora of its own issues. Do you think the country had a choice? Are people also aware, like we heard there from Melusi, about what happened? Is there a backlash?
Yes, it's the same. The government was not transparent about these deals. And the people were caught unaware. They were shocked that the country, which is struggling with lots of economic breakdowns, humanitarian emergencies, for which it has no capacity to address, would actually take on new people. So this created already like a social, heavy social cost because the government is not able to really provide for its own citizens. And these deals did not look good. And the government denied it first, and then they eventually admitted that these people were coming over.
So, I mean, Melusi, this one to you. Is this about political pressure? Is this about corruption? How would you describe these countries taking on these murky deals from the Trump administration, taking in people, as you know, as Daniel said there, that have already served their time, where they're not even from the countries they're going to?
Right, there are no familial ties, there are no legal ties to them being in Eswatini or South Sudan for that matter. But I believe it is more than just political pressure. I think it's corruption, because if you look at these deals that the United States is striking with African countries, or rather, let's say, countries from the global South, these are countries with weaker democracies. These are countries that they have little or no checks and balances. So the Trump administration knows exactly what it is doing and is continuing its sort of political gymnastic using the global South as a conduit to continue their immigration policies in America. But for Eswatini, I would perhaps say it's because Eswatini remains the only country in Africa with bilateral relations with Taiwan. And as you may know, the United States and their sort of trade wars that they're having with mainland China, they are using Eswatini to sort of continue these sort of deals. But we are hearing that there might have been an exchange of money, which then goes back to that question of transparency with our government. It goes back to that question of accountability in saying if there was money involved, where is the money going? Is it going to the fiscus, or is it going to remain with the ruling elite in these countries that have got little or not democracy at all?
Well, it's not just the citizens of Eswatini and South Sudan. People online are also starting to call these deportations out, saying that this is not a U.S. national security issue. Listen to this.
These men were deported in direct violation of a federal judge's orders, an order that required meaningful notice and a chance to raise torture concerns before being sent to a third country. Reminder, South Sudan has been in a brutal civil war since 2013. 2/3 of the population relies on humanitarian aid. The U.S. literally says, do not travel. Under U.S. and international law, we cannot deport anyone to a country wherein they face a substantial risk of torture. And that is not a suggestion, by the way, that is a binding obligation. So when the Trump administration ignores that law and a judge's order, they're not just breaking protocol, they're violating the Constitution and impeding on basic human rights. And let's be clear, this was not about national security, it was not about justice, this was about political theater at the expense of human lives. Plain and simple, deporting Vietnamese and Burmese asylum seekers to South Sudan is unlawful and dangerous.
Daniel, what do you know about the men that were deported to South Sudan?
The deal was, South Sudanese government was focusing on accepting the deals, but what happens to these deportees, it remains a secondary consent to them. So people are not aware of where these foreigners who were deported into South Sudan are, but there was at least one South Sudanese who was deported, and people are saying that he has been released into the community, which is also a dangerous move, and it shows the lack of capacity from the government to manage these processes effectively.
Melusi, what kind of legal recourse, if any, do these men have? And also, they're not, as we mentioned there, they're not from the countries they're going to. In fact, from some of the research, from I understand, a lot of them are Asian, of Asian nationalities. Do they have any rights?
You see, what had happened in Eswatini is that as soon as we heard about them being brought to the country, we then thought, what does the domestic legal framework look like? These are people who are now being held in our correctional service facilities, or we can say in our prisons, particularly a maximum security prison. So what we then did was, how are these people being incarcerated in Eswatini without having been convicted by a competent court of law? So that is why we then went to the courts to say these people need to be brought before a judge so that we can understand, number one, how did they get into the country? What were the immigration laws that were followed, or policies or regulations that were followed? But the judge threw that out the window. In fact, they eventually won to grant access to a human rights lawyer in Swaziland to go into the prison facilities to speak to them. But the state quickly appealed that. So you can see that there's a lot of corruption, as you had said earlier, Stefanie, that goes into this deal, where there is a lot of secrecy and the agreements and the details of the agreements are shrouded in secrecy. So there is quite a lot that the government has to answer for, which is precisely why we have taken the matter to the court to say, what was the constitutional sort of steps by step that was supposed to be followed in ensuring that Eswatini gets into an agreement with the United States to bring these people into Eswatini. Because I think we must not run away from calling this what it is. This is human trafficking at the very top of what is known as the leader of democracy in the world.
And I want to follow up with you a little later about what it is that you are hoping to get out of petitioning the High Court. Well, those two countries did accept this deal from the Trump administration, but Nigeria refused to take in many deportees from the U.S. And social media users criticized the Trump administration for trying to pressure the Nigerian government to take them in.
So let's get this straight. Sid, who has placed a ban on every country on the continent of Africa, is apparently in his feelings because the president of Nigeria has told him, no, we are not going to accept any of your deportees. Because how you gonna call them people a country? You claim that there's a white genocide going on in South Africa. You bash Africans every chance you get. You say that these people are living in huts and all of that. But then you have the absolute caucasity to want them to take your prisoners, your deportees. And then when they turn you down, then you want to be mad about it?
Melusi, I saw you laughing at the word caucasity. I had the same reaction when I first listened to her. Daniel, Burkina Faso also rejected Trump's offer, calling it indecent and contrary to the value of dignity. Why, one of the questions I was asking, why haven't these men, for example, considering they are being deported, being sent to their own home countries?
Yeah, it's well, the question of why some countries accepted and others were able to refuse, first is very important because it boils down to a fundamental difference in leverage, in sovereignty, and internal stability. In the case of South Sudan, everything is wrong in South Sudan. You have the sovereignty is shared. You have international security forces guarding the national capital. So it's very fragile. You have the parties that should be in the same government arresting each other. So it's a country that is very vulnerable. So there is, in a sense, a vulnerability of that states might have been exploited. But then you also look at and I agree with Melusi on this, the corruption aspects, where the local leadership, the South Sudanese leadership, was hoping to gain diplomatic gain through this acceptance of these deportees. In South Sudan, there was not much of decisions by people being deported. It was pretty much sort of like imposed upon them, because it would be the last place you would choose at this given crisis to be in South Sudan.
Melusi, you alluded to it earlier. For our audience, break it down in simple terms. Who are these men? Trump says they're convicted criminals. They seem to have served their time in the U.S. The whole process of this, is this legal? How do you view it?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, Stefanie, we must not run away from calling it what it is. This is human trafficking that is being done by the leader of democracy in the world. Because what the United States government has done is, quite frankly, lying to the audience, whoever the audience is supposed to be, to say these are criminals that are being sent to third-party countries. But number one, I'll agree with Daniel that it also matters where these people are being sent to. They are not going to be sent to a country like Nigeria, obviously, or a country like South Africa with stronger democratic institutions internally. They're being sent to countries with weaker democratic institutions and weaker democratic values, where they know that there will be no one who will ask the questions. So these are people who are being dragged off of the street, being put into flights, and being sent into our countries. And I think it's important to note here, Stefan, the fact that I think the fallacious power of the West is waning, and what the Americans are doing with all of these deportations is trying to bolster their exceptionalism, trying to weaponize the American citizenship to say only a few can be Americans and only a few can be residents in their countries, because they can see that they are losing power in the world. This sort of post-Cold War power that they sort of held, the monopoly that they had in world politics is waning away, and therefore they're weaponizing citizenship and they're weaponizing immigration policies to sort of bolster their image, which is waning. And I think it's unfortunate that countries are not standing up against this. And there's only a few in civil society like myself and Daniel who are standing up, particularly against our own domestic countries. Perhaps not the American conversation because that's out of our jurisdiction, but to talk to our internal governments and talk to our sovereignty and talk to our democratic values. And these are democratic values that we remember, Stefanie, that were hard fought for and blood was shed for us to gain independence and for us to gain this democracy that we are seeing fail at this moment. So we must stand up and say, no, we're not going to allow our leaders to get into these agreements without consulting us, the people, without consulting civil society, and worst of all in Eswatini, without consulting parliament, who actually has the sovereign right, according to the constitution, to scrutinize whatever agreement our executive gets into.
Absolutely, and picking up on that point, there are also a lot of articles I was reading really underlying the racist tone of this from the Trump administration. Now, more and more African content creators are expressing frustrations over why their content is being used for these deporting schemes, like this gentleman on TikTok.
We all got news that the United States deported some of the violent criminals, as they call it, to some of our African countries. They deported some to Eswatini. They also deported some of them to South Sudan. Why is it that whenever they want to dump their stuffs or they want to dump anything, and now that it has to do with these violent criminals, the best place that they think they should deport these people to is Africa? Why is it always Africa? Like I said before, if we start getting angry now, they will start coming for our videos, they will start flagging us and all of that. But why? Why is it that they always think that all the bad things should always go to Africa? When they want to carry out their test, when they need human beings to use like guinea pigs to carry out their test, their trial processes, it's Africa.
Daniel, what's your reaction to that? Do you feel the same way?
Well, the situation of these deals, around these deals, adds further complexity to South Sudan already fragile environments, in illustrating how external powers may exploit vulnerability. And this is something that many people are expressing about South Sudan. It's a country on its knees. It's a country that is facing multiple humanitarian crises.
So is this something that they're taking advantage of so they can dump these men, so to speak, in those terms, because there's not much the government can do, or they want the money?
I doubt if it is just the money. Because the countries are not really uniform. There are countries where people actually could get some small money. But the people behind this decision in South Sudan are very wealthy. And actually, they got into a problem because of corruptions in the past, and there had been sanctions by the US. And they were hoping that if they could do a deal like this, those sanctions might be lifted, or at least some ease on those sanctions from the US. So it's a bit different from a country to a country, but it's the fundamental similarity is really the vulnerability of the countries that are being targeted.
Yes, we heard that there have been countries who have rejected this, and they're not sending them, to Italy or to Malaysia. Melusi, Trump is not the first US president to carry out deportations. We saw it under George W. Bush. We saw it under Barack Obama. But he's doing it in a very different way. Why is that?
I think, as I'd mentioned earlier, Stefanie, they are parading what it means to an American. And it goes back to this conversation around bolstering their exceptionalism, because they can see that their power is waning around the world. Nobody is taking them as serious as perhaps they would have post-Cold War. And I think they are now using these deportations as a sort of a weapon to say it costs so much to an American, and it's going to cost as much to get into a trade deal with us. You remember these trade tariffs that the Trump administration has sort of slapped almost everyone in the world. In Eswatini, we know for a fact that the tariffs that were slapped on Eswatini were very little. And one would understand that it's because Eswatini has agreed to sort of play in this political game where they're actually trafficking individuals from the US to Eswatini. And I think it's a problem because it also goes back to this conversation around human rights. These people are being kept in prison cells that in Eswatini, for instance, are overcrowded, they are under-resourced. And this is according to a UNDP report in coordination with the local Human Rights Commission to say the prisons in Eswatini are overcrowded by over 170%. And now you are bringing these people to be kept in these prison cells, number one, having not been convicted by any competent court of law in Swaziland, but also having not been in any sort of treaty agreement between the US and Eswatini that involved parliament as in accordance with the constitution. So there's a lot of conversation that we could have around the human rights violation, but I think fundamentally for me, it speaks to the waning power of the US, and they're now utilizing this weaponization of immigration to sort of bolster their exceptionalism, which is dying out in the world.
Daniel, I want to broaden this out at this point. When we talk about immigration, migration, of course, this is due to a lot of social and economic reasons. But, you know, many are also now talking about climate change, that there is going to be more and more migration from areas like Africa, for example, to further north because places are simply going to become uninhabitable. How do you see things moving forward when you have countries reacting to migrants in this way?
It's not very easy because in places like South Sudan, migration is actually massive. Displacement is massive. But it's at the same time, there are ways to organize the movement of people. This is what we've been hearing over the years. This particular deportations it wasn't actually following those ethical rules. Migrating people on planes. It's very rare things for something like that to happen. But this is a conversation that is needed in Africa. People need to talk about. It's usually the migrations, voluntary ones. It seems to be out of Africa most of the time, and now we are seeing in the opposite direction. So people need to talk about this in a kind of sort of like a democratic manner. So the people are denied. This is a decision made by vulnerable leaders. People either are sanctioned and they are hoping to get on the good book of Trump, President Trump, or they want to get some money to do this. This is not their job. It's a much larger issue that involves more and more people at the grassroots who could be affected socially because of these decisions. Yeah.
A lot of political maneuvering and bartering, as we heard there from one of our clips, at the expense of human lives. Melusi, how do you see this moving forward? You are part of a push at the High Court in Eswatini. Do you think that is actually, it's a hard question because obviously you hope it's going to have an effect, realistically speaking, with the government that you have. Do you think it's going to open the books?
You know, the organization that I work for, the Southern Africa Litigation, with the Southern Africa Litigation Center, we've got a mantra around something called strategic litigation. Oftentimes, you do not go to court hoping to win. You just go to court hoping that you can empower more people and enable more people to voice their concern and to raise issues. And particularly in this case, we know that the country continued to receive an extra 10 individuals in this agreement that they have, even though they know that the case pending in court. One would have expected that at least the court would have granted as an interim interdict where they would say the country must stop receiving these individuals while we are having a conversation about the constitutionality of this agreement. But this did not happen. The country is continuing to receive more people. We do not know when the next plane will land with these people who are being actually trafficked from America to Eswatini. But what we're hoping the courts will do here is actually speak and pronounce once and for all that there is a concept of separation of powers, which is what our 20-year-old constitution is all about, the democratic principles of separation of powers, where the Prime Minister and head of executive cannot get into an agreement with the United States without consulting Parliament. Mind you, Stefanie, this is an agreement that has already upset or maybe sort of put into question with South Africa, who is our biggest neighbor, South Africa, who in terms of our trade, around 70% of our trade goes through South Africa. They've already raised concern about this agreement because of the way that our borders are set up. But I think the conversation is more about, are we going to continue as Africa to hold on to our democratic values, or are we going to go back to the era, as Daniel said, where migration was happening without the grassroots conversation, without the sort of democratic and open conversation amongst people? Because migration is going to continue happening. No matter how loud the Trump administration sort of blows their trumpet, migration conversation is always going to happen, but it's a conversation of whether or not it's happening within the framework of international human rights law, or it's happening through human trafficking, as we're seeing right now.
Absolutely. Human rights and empathy, I think, also something very important for people to keep in mind. Daniel, final thoughts to you. Do you think South Sudan will benefit, get what they want out of this deal?
It's a tall order. Asking for the sanction to be lifted is not something that in the US would be done by a few people that were involved in signing this deal with the government of South Sudan. So I doubt if they will get that, but there might be some benefits, much of kind of lower value for the corporations, and these are mainly diplomatic bargains that they could get. On a wider scale, there's not much benefits, really.
Well, gentlemen, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And thank you for tuning in. Before we go, we want to hear from you. Do you have a comment about our show or want to see us discuss a certain topic? Get in touch, because this is also your show. And we're always open to your suggestions. Send us a message on social media, AJ Stream, and we'll check it out. For me and the entire Stream team, I'll see you next time.